The sun sets, and the city transforms. The crowds vanish, the lights hum, and the silence takes over. This is the graveyard shift, where the buildings are empty, but the danger is full. In this series, we explore the crimes that happen when the world is asleep, and only the watchmen are left to face the dark. They are the sentinels we never see, the people who lock the doors after we leave, who patrol the hallways when the offices go quiet, who stand guard while we sleep safely in our beds. But sometimes, the buildings they protect become tombs. And sometimes, the shadows hide more than just emptiness. A flashlight beam cuts through a dark hallway. A set of keys jingles in an empty corridor. A security monitor flickers, showing nothing but static and shadows. For security guards and night porters, the job is 99% boredom and 1% pure terror. You spend hours walking the same routes, checking the same doors, watching the same cameras. The world outside goes to sleep. The building becomes yours, vast, empty, quiet. And in that quiet, your mind starts to play tricks on you. Was that footstep real, or just the building settling? Was that shadow always there, or did it just move? But sometimes, the terror isn't in your head. Sometimes, it walks through the door. Sometimes, it's already inside, waiting. Tonight, we're unlocking the stories of the Night Watch, the men and women who stood between the darkness and the dawn. From the art heist of the century in Boston to the lonely guard shacks of Florida, these are the crimes that happened when the buildings were empty and the killers entered. Let's begin. The Silence of the Gardener. March 18th, 1990. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston is a temple to beauty. Built in the style of a 15th century Venetian palace, it houses one of the most extraordinary private art collections in the world. Rembrandts, Vermeers, Manets, Degas. The galleries are filled with masterpieces that have survived centuries, wars, and the passage of time. The museum is a sanctuary, a place where art is protected, preserved, and revered. Isabella Stewart Gardner herself designed every aspect of the museum before her death in 1924, and her will contained a strict provision. Nothing could be moved, nothing could be changed. Every painting, every sculpture, every piece of furniture had to remain exactly where she placed it. The museum wasn't just a collection. It was a frozen moment in time, a testament to one woman's vision and passion. But on the night of March 18, 1990, that sanctuary was violated in what would become the most infamous property crime in history. It's 1:24 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The museum is closed. The galleries are dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of emergency lighting and the occasional beam of a security guard's flashlight. The only people inside are two security guards, Rick Abath, 23, and Randy Hestan, 25. They're working the overnight shift, a job that involves sitting at a desk in the lobby, monitoring the security cameras, and making periodic rounds through the empty hallways. It's boring work, the kind of job where you fight to stay awake, where you count down the hours until dawn, where the silence becomes so oppressive that you start to welcome any kind of distraction. The museum, with its priceless art and its palatial architecture, is beautiful during the day. But at night, it's eerie. The galleries stretch into darkness. The statues cast long shadows. The paintings seem to watch you as you walk past. Rick Abath is stationed at the security desk in the lobby. He's been on shift for several hours, and the monotony is setting in. Randy Heston is somewhere in the interior of the museum, making his rounds. The night has been quiet, uneventful. Exactly what you want from a security shift. Until the buzzer rings. Abath looks up. On the intercom, he hears a voice. Boston Police. We're responding to a disturbance call in the area. Can you let us in? He glances at the security monitor. Two men in police uniforms stand outside the side entrance, the employee entrance on Palace Road. They're wearing the standard Boston Police uniform. Dark blue, badges visible, hats on. They look official. They sound official. And in the early hours of the morning, when your brain is foggy from boredom and your guard is down, you don't question authority. Abath hesitates for a moment. Museum protocol is clear. Don't let anyone in during the overnight shift. But these are police officers. They say they're investigating a disturbance. Refusing them would seem suspicious, obstructive even. What if there really is something going on outside? What if they need to check the perimeter? So Rick Abath makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He buzzes them in. The two men step into the lobby, and immediately, Abath senses something is off. Their demeanor is calm, but there's a coldness to it. They move with purpose, scanning the space with practiced eyes. One of them approaches the security desk and looks directly at Abath. "You look familiar," he says. "I think there's a warrant out for your arrest. Step away from the desk." Abath is confused. A warrant? For what? He's never been in serious trouble with the law, but the authority in the man's voice is absolute. It's the kind of command that doesn't invite argument. And Abath, young and inexperienced, does what most people would do when confronted by a police officer. He complies. He steps away from the desk, away from the panic button, away from the only tool that could summon help. And that's when everything changes. Within seconds, the situation escalates. The two men drop the pretense. They're not police officers. They're thieves, and they've just gained complete control of the museum. One of them produces handcuffs. The other pulls out duct tape. They move with efficiency, with the kind of calm precision that suggests this isn't their first robbery. Randy Heston, hearing voices in the lobby, emerges from the interior of the museum. He's immediately overpowered, ordered to the ground, handcuffed. Both guards are told to cooperate, to stay calm, to do exactly as they're told. The thieves explain, in matter-of-fact tones, that this is a robbery. They're not here to hurt anyone. They just want the art. As long as the guards don't resist, don't make noise, don't try to be heroes, everything will be fine. But there's an underlying threat in those words. The implication is clear. Resist, and there will be consequences. The guards are marched through the museum, away from the public spaces, down into the basement. It's a part of the building the public never sees. Damp stone walls, low ceilings, exposed pipes, storage rooms filled with crates and maintenance equipment. The air is cool, musty. The lighting is harsh and intermittent, bare bulbs hanging from wires casting stark shadows. It feels less like a museum and more like a dungeon. The guards are separated. Rick Abath is handcuffed to a workbench in one room. Randy Heston is cuffed to a pipe in another. The thieves work methodically, wrapping duct tape around the guards' heads, over their eyes, over their mouths, layer after layer, until they can barely breathe. The tape is tight, suffocating, disorienting. Abath can feel his heart pounding, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps through his nose. One of the thieves leans close and speaks quietly. "Don't move. Don't make a sound. We'll be gone soon. If you cooperate, you'll be fine." And then the footsteps fade. The basement goes silent. And Rick Abath and Randy Heston are left alone in the darkness, completely helpless. For the next 81 minutes, they lie there, bound and blind. They can't see. They can barely breathe. They can hear the muffled sounds of footsteps above them, moving through the galleries. They hear voices, calm, professional, discussing logistics like workmen on a job site. They hear the occasional thud, the sound of something being moved or dropped. And they know, with a sickening certainty, that the museum is being robbed. You might wonder what goes through your mind when you're in that situation. When you're bound in a basement, unable to move, unable to see, unable to call for help. When you can hear the crime happening above you and there's nothing, absolutely nothing, you can do to stop it. Fear, certainly. The primal terror of being utterly helpless, but also guilt. The crushing realization that you made a mistake, that you let them in, that you enabled this, and the desperate hope that when this is over, when the thieves are gone, you'll still be alive. Upstairs, the thieves move through the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum like surgeons performing a delicate operation. They don't ransack. They don't smash display cases or grab everything in sight. They know exactly what they want, and they move with the confidence of people who have studied the layout, who have planned this down to the minute. They go directly to the Dutch room on the second floor. This gallery houses some of the museum's most prized possessions, and the thieves have clearly done their homework. On the walls hang Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, his only known seascape, and A Lady and Gentleman in Black, a double portrait from 1633. There's also a small Rembrandt self-portrait etching and Goviert Flink's landscape with an obelisk, a painting once attributed to Rembrandt himself. But the crown jewel of the room, at least in terms of value and rarity, is Vermeer's The Concert. Painted around 1664, it's one of only 34 known works by Johannes Vermeer, the Dutch master whose paintings are so rare that their value is almost incalculable. The concert depicts three figures making music in a domestic interior, a scene of quiet intimacy and extraordinary technical skill. The thieves approach the paintings, but they don't gently remove them from their frames. They don't have the time or the tools for that. Instead, they pull out knives, or possibly a box cutter, and they slice the canvases from the frames. The cuts are rough, pragmatic, brutal. Centuries-old masterpieces are severed from their wooden supports, rolled up, and prepared for transport. The sound of the blade cutting through canvas, if anyone had been there to hear it, would have been sickening. A violation not just of property, but of history itself. The thieves move efficiently through the museum. They take Edouard Manet's Chaise Tortoni, a small portrait of a man in a top hat, sitting in a Parisian café. They take 5 sketches by Edgar Degas, preparatory drawings, studies, nothing as famous as his ballet paintings, but valuable nonetheless. They take a bronze eagle finial that once topped a Napoleonic flag, a strange, heavy object that seems out of place among the paintings. In total, they steal 13 pieces of art. The total value, estimated conservatively at the time, was around $200. Today, adjusted for inflation and the increasing scarcity of old master works, the stolen art is valued at over $500 million. But the true value, the cultural, historical, and artistic value, is immeasurable. These aren't just commodities. They're pieces of human achievement, windows into the past, works that can never be replicated. And the thieves treat them like merchandise, cutting them from frames, rolling them up, stuffing them into bags. The entire operation takes 81 minutes, not a second longer than necessary. The thieves know that the longer they stay, the greater the risk. But they also know that the guards are secured, that the museum security system has been neutralized, and that they have a window of time before anyone realizes what's happening. At 2:45 a.m. they leave. They walk out the same side entrance they entered, carrying bags filled with rolled-up masterpieces. They climb into a vehicle. Witnesses later reported seeing a car matching the description, but the details were vague, and they drive away. The museum is silent again. The empty frames hang on the walls, gaping voids where Rembrandt and Vermeer once hung. And in the basement, Rick Abath and Randy Hestand remain bound in the darkness, waiting. It isn't until 8:15 a.m., nearly 7 hours after the thieves entered, that the day shift security staff arrive at the museum. They notice immediately that something is wrong. The guards aren't at their posts. The security desk is empty. There's a strange stillness to the building. They call out. No response. They search the lobby, the galleries, the offices, and then they hear muffled sounds coming from the basement. They rush downstairs and find Rick Abath and Randy Hestand, still handcuffed, still wrapped in duct tape, barely able to breathe. They're freed immediately. Abath and Hestand stumble up the stairs, disoriented, terrified, and traumatized. And as they emerge into the galleries, they see the empty frames. They see the jagged edges where the canvases were cut. They see the gaps where the Degas sketches used to be. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum has been robbed. The thieves are gone, and the art, the priceless, irreplaceable art, is gone with them. The investigation that follows is one of the largest and most intensive in FBI history. Agents descend on the museum within hours. They interview the guards extensively, process every inch of the crime scene, analyze the security footage. Though the cameras, frustratingly, didn't capture clear images of the thieves' faces. The tapes show 2 figures in police uniforms, but the resolution is too poor to identify them. Rick Abath and Randy Hestand become the focus of intense scrutiny. Why did Abath let the police officers in? Why didn't he follow protocol? Was he complicit? Was he paid off? The FBI administers polygraph tests. They comb through Abath's financial records, his phone calls, his personal life. They interrogate him for hours, pressing him on every detail, looking for inconsistencies. But the tests come back clean. The financial records show nothing suspicious. And Abath's terror, captured on tape during his interviews, is genuine. The investigators eventually conclude that Abath was a victim, not an accomplice. He made a catastrophic mistake by buzzing the thieves in, but he wasn't part of the heist. He was a young, inexperienced security guard who was manipulated by professionals. Randy Heston is similarly cleared. He had no involvement beyond being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So the focus shifts to the thieves themselves. Who were they? How did they know so much about the museum's layout and security protocols? How did they know which paintings to target? Over the decades, countless theories have emerged. Some investigators believe the heist was orchestrated by organized crime, specifically members of the Boston Irish mob or the Italian mafia. These groups had a history of high-value thefts, and they had the connections to fence stolen art or use it as collateral in criminal dealings. One name that surfaces repeatedly is James Whitey Bulger, the notorious Boston mob boss. Some believe Bulger's organization was involved, though no concrete evidence has ever tied him directly to the heist. Other suspects include members of the Merlino crime family in Philadelphia and various international art theft rings. In 2013, the FBI announced a major development. They believed they knew the identities of the thieves. They stated that the suspects were members of a criminal organization based in the Mid-Atlantic region, and that at least some of them were now deceased. But the FBI declined to name the suspects publicly, and they offered no explanation for why, if they knew who committed the heist, they still hadn't recovered the art. That announcement was both tantalizing and frustrating. It suggested the case was close to being solved, yet the paintings remained missing. Theories about the location of the stolen art are equally varied. Some believe the paintings were sold on the black market to private collectors, wealthy individuals who commissioned the theft and now keep the works hidden in private vaults, never to be displayed publicly again. Others believe the art was used as collateral in criminal transactions, passed from one underworld figure to another over the years. There have been reported sightings. Informants have claimed to know where the paintings are hidden. Leads have taken investigators to Ireland, to Japan, to warehouses in Philadelphia, to private estates in Europe. But every lead has gone cold. Every claimed sighting has turned out to be false. In 2015, the statute of limitations on the theft expired, meaning that anyone involved in the heist could theoretically come forward without facing criminal charges for the theft itself, though they could still be charged with other crimes like conspiracy or receiving stolen property. The museum and the FBI hoped this might encourage someone to provide information, but no one came forward. The stolen paintings have now been missing for over 30 years. An entire generation has grown up without ever seeing the storm on the Sea of Galilee or the concert in person. Art historians, conservators, and enthusiasts can only study them through photographs and reproductions. But this story isn't just about the paintings. It's about Rick Abath and Randy Heston, two young men who were doing their jobs, who trusted the wrong people, and who spent 81 minutes bound and helpless in a basement while history was stolen above them. Rick Abath, in particular, has lived with the weight of that night for over 30 years. He's been interviewed countless times. He's been portrayed in documentaries, podcasts, and books. He's been suspected, vilified, and scrutinized. And through it all, he's maintained his innocence and his regret. In interviews, Abath has described the terror of that night, the sensation of the duct tape tightening around his face, the inability to breathe properly, the panic of not knowing if the thieves would come back and kill them. He's described the guilt, the endless replaying of the moment he buzzed them in, the knowledge that his decision, made in a split second in the fog of a boring overnight shift, enabled one of the greatest art thefts in history. You might wonder what that kind of guilt does to a person, how it shapes the rest of your life, how every news story about the heist, every anniversary, every documentary, brings it all back. The basement, the darkness, the helplessness. The empty frames still hang on the walls of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Isabella Stewart Gardner's will stipulated that nothing in the museum could be changed after her death, so the frames remain where she placed them. They've become almost as famous as the paintings themselves, ghostly reminders of what was lost. Visitors to the museum stand in front of those empty frames and feel the absence. It's a unique kind of mourning, grieving for art that isn't destroyed but simply gone. hidden Dashti, waiting. The museum offers a $10 reward for information, leading to the recovery of the stolen works in good condition. It's one of the largest rewards ever offered for stolen property, but so far, no one has claimed it. The investigation remains active. The FBI still maintains a dedicated tip line. The museum still hopes, against all odds, that one day the paintings will be recovered. But with each passing year, that hope dims. The people who committed the heist are likely dead or elderly. The art may have been destroyed, damaged by improper storage, or lost in the chaos of the criminal underworld. The trail has gone cold so many times that it's hard to imagine it ever warming up again. The silence of the Gardner isn't just about the 81 minutes Rick Abath and Randy Heston spent bound in the basement. It's about the 30 years of silence that have followed. The silence of the investigators who can't find the art. The silence of the criminals who won't talk. The silence of the empty frames on the walls. And it's about the realization that when you're a security guard working the night shift, you are the first line of defense, but you're also the most vulnerable target. You're alone, isolated. And if someone with bad intentions decides to exploit that vulnerability, there's often nothing you can do to stop them. Rick Abath and Randy Heston survived that night, but the psychological scars remain. And the art, the storm on the Sea of Galilee, the concert, Chase Tortoni, remains lost, hidden somewhere in the shadows, waiting for a light that may never come. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist is the most famous property crime in history. But for the guards who lived through it, it's not about fame or art or money. It's about the terror of being helpless, the guilt of being manipulated, and the silence. The suffocating, endless silence of a night that changed everything. The trailer in the dark. The murder of Patrick McDonald. Beverly, Massachusetts, 1994. There's a certain kind of loneliness that comes with guarding a construction site. It's not like protecting a museum or a corporate office where there's history, value, something tangible to defend. A construction site is just dirt and steel, and the promise of what will eventually be. It's raw, unfinished, and vast. And in the middle of it all, there's usually a trailer. A small, temporary office where the security guard sits, watching the darkness, waiting for dawn. Patrick McDonald knew that loneliness. In 1994, he was working the overnight security shift at a construction site in Beverly, Massachusetts, a quiet coastal town north of Boston. The site was being developed into a new Shaw's supermarket, but at the time, it was nothing more than a muddy expanse of excavated earth, piles of building materials, and heavy machinery sitting silent under the night sky. The perimeter was fenced with chain link, but the fence was more symbolic than secure, just tall enough to deter casual trespassers, but easy enough to climb over or cut through if someone was determined. Patrick's job was simple, at least on paper. Sit in the trailer, keep an eye on the equipment, deter thieves, and call the police if anything went wrong. It was a job that required presence more than action. The trailer itself was small, just big enough for a desk, a chair, a space heater, a phone, and a lockbox for petty cash. It had a single window that looked out over the construction site, and a door that locked from the inside. During the day, the site was alive with activity, workers, trucks, the sound of machinery and progress. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely. At night, the construction site was a wasteland. The dirt turned to mud when it rained. The machinery cast long, skeletal shadows in the moonlight. The wind howled through the exposed beams of unfinished structures. And Patrick McDonald sat in the trailer, alone, with nothing but the hum of the space heater and the occasional crackle of the AM radio to keep him company. He was the only living soul for hundreds of yards in any direction. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact timeline of what happened on the night Patrick McDonald was murdered, because by the time his body was discovered, hours had already passed. The crime occurred in the dead of night, likely between 2 and 4 a.m., when the world is at its darkest and quietest, when even the occasional car passing on the nearby road becomes a rare event. But investigators were able to piece together a rough sequence of events based on the crime scene, witness statements, and forensic evidence. Sometime in those early morning hours, two men approached the construction site. They weren't there to steal heavy equipment. Construction sites are often targeted for expensive machinery, but moving a bulldozer or excavator requires trucks, coordination, and time. These men were after something simpler, faster, easier: the lockbox in the trailer. Construction sites often keep small amounts of cash on hand for minor expenses, paying day laborers in cash, buying materials from local suppliers, handling incidentals that can't wait for a check to clear. It's never a large amount, usually a few $100s at most, sometimes less. But for some people, a few $100s is enough to kill for. The men approached the trailer. Whether they knocked first, whether they tried to talk their way in by claiming to be workers or supervisors, whether they simply forced the door open, those details are lost to the silence of that night. What's clear is that Patrick McDonald was inside when they entered, and he didn't survive the encounter. Patrick was shot. The gunshot tore through the confined space of the trailer, and he collapsed. The sound would have been deafening inside that small metal box, but outside, surrounded by acres of emptiness, it was swallowed by the night. No one heard it. No neighbors came running. No passing cars stopped to investigate. The heavy machinery sat silent, indifferent witnesses to the violence unfolding in the trailer. The men ransacked a small office. They found a lockbox. Investigators later estimated it contained less than $300, possibly as little as $150. And they took it. They left Patrick's body slumped in the cramped space, surrounded by construction paperwork, work schedules, safety notices pinned to the walls, and the cold, sterile functionality of a temporary workspace that would never be permanent for him. Then they fled. They likely climbed back over the fence or slipped through a gap they'd created earlier. They disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness of Beverly, carrying a lockbox that contained less money than a week's worth of groceries, leaving behind a dead man whose only crime was being in the way. Patrick McDonald bled out in that trailer. Whether he died instantly or lingered for minutes, in pain and alone, is something only the forensic evidence could suggest. But either way, by the time the sun began to rise over Beverly, Patrick was gone. His body was discovered later that morning when the day shift arrived. Construction workers, pulling into the site just after dawn, noticed something was wrong immediately. The trailer door was open, which was unusual. Patrick was supposed to lock it from the inside during his shift. When they approached, calling out his name, there was no response. They found him inside, and the scene was immediately clear. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was murder. The Beverly Police Department was called, and within minutes, the construction site was transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the trailer. Detectives and forensic technicians processed the scene, photographing the interior, collecting shell casings, dusting for fingerprints, searching for any evidence the killers might have left behind. The shock rippled through the small community of Beverly. This wasn't a high-crime area. Beverly is a coastal town with historic neighborhoods, beaches, and a reputation for safety. Murders were rare, and the idea that a security guard had been killed at a construction site, shot for pocket change, was almost incomprehensible. Patrick's family was devastated. He was in his 40s, a working man who had taken on the night shift security job to supplement his income. He had a family who depended on him. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't powerful. He was just a guy sitting in a trailer, watching over dirt and machinery, doing his job. And he was killed for less than $300. The investigation was immediate and intensive. The Beverly Police Department, with assistance from the Massachusetts State Police and the Essex County District Attorney's Office, launched a full-scale homicide investigation. They interviewed everyone associated with the construction site: the project manager, the workers, the subcontractors, the security company that had hired Patrick. They canvassed the neighborhood, looking for witnesses who might have seen or heard something unusual that night. They collected physical evidence from the trailer: the shell casing from the bullet that killed Patrick, fingerprints lifted from surfaces the killers might have touched, trace evidence like fibers or hair. They analyzed the lockbox, or rather, the fact that it was missing, which established the motive clearly: robbery. But the challenges were immense. The construction site was isolated, set back from the main road, surrounded by undeveloped land. There were no security cameras. This was 1994, and surveillance technology wasn't as ubiquitous as it is today. Most construction sites didn't have video systems beyond perhaps a basic camera pointed at the entrance, and even that was rare. There were no witnesses to the shooting. The nearest houses were several hundred yards away, and the residents reported hearing nothing unusual that night. The perimeter fence had been breached in multiple places. Some of the gaps were old, created by workers taking shortcuts, and some might have been created by the killers. It was impossible to determine exactly where they had entered or exited. The killers themselves had left minimal physical evidence. The fingerprints recovered from the trailer were compared against databases, but they didn't match any known offenders. The shell casing was collected, but without a weapon to match it to. And without witnesses or clear suspects, the investigation began to lose momentum. Detectives pursued every possible angle. They looked into whether Patrick had been targeted specifically. Had he had problems with anyone? Had he mentioned feeling threatened or unsafe? But interviews with his family and friends revealed nothing. Patrick was well-liked, had no known enemies, wasn't involved in anything that would make him a target. They investigated whether the killers were familiar with the site, former workers perhaps, who knew about the lockbox and the security routine. But that line of inquiry led nowhere. The construction crew was small, local, and fully accounted for. They looked at similar crimes in the region, searching for patterns. Had other construction sites been targeted? Were there other security guards who had been threatened or attacked? But no clear pattern emerged. The case went cold, not because investigators gave up, but because there was nowhere left to go. Without witnesses, without clear physical evidence linking specific individuals to the crime, and without a suspect pool to narrow down, the trail went cold. Tips came in sporadically over the months and years that followed. People called the police claiming to have information, claiming to know who was responsible. But every tip, when investigated, led nowhere. The men who killed Patrick McDonald had vanished into the anonymity of the night. You might wonder why someone would take a security job at a construction site in the first place. The answer is economic necessity. These jobs pay modestly. Not great, but steady. They require minimal qualifications, no specialized training, no college degree. And they offer night shifts, which can be appealing for people who need to work around other responsibilities or who are supplementing income from another job. But the reality of the job is that you're being paid to be a target. You're being paid to sit in a vulnerable location, a trailer, a guard shack, a small office, and deter crime by your presence alone. You're not given tools to defend yourself in most cases. No weapon, no panic button that summons immediate help. Just a phone, and the hope that if something goes wrong, you'll have time to use it. Patrick McDonald didn't have time. The isolation of the construction site is what makes this case a quintessential night watch nightmare. Patrick was surrounded by acres of emptiness. The nearest building was hundreds of yards away. The nearest occupied house even farther. When the shot rang out, no one heard it. When he fell, no one came running. He died alone, in a trailer in the dark, while the world slept. The construction site where Patrick McDonald was murdered eventually became the Shaw's supermarket. It was always meant to be. The trailer was hauled away, sold off, or scrapped. The dirt was graded, paved over, and turned into a parking lot. The building was completed, open to the public, and filled with shoppers buying groceries, pushing carts through aisles, completely unaware of the violence that had occurred on that exact spot years earlier. There's no memorial, no plaque, nothing to mark the place where Patrick McDonald spent his last moments. The supermarket operates as it always has, a mundane, everyday place that holds no memory of the tragedy that enabled its existence. But Patrick's family never forgot. They never got justice. They never got answers. The men who killed him were never caught, never charged, never held accountable. And that's what makes this case so deeply, profoundly haunting. It's not just the violence. It's the disposability. It's the realization that Patrick McDonald was killed for an amount of money that wouldn't even cover a week's rent. That his life was worth less, in the eyes of his killers, than the cost of a tank of gas. That two men could shoot him, take the lockbox, and walk away, and the world would barely notice. Security guards at construction sites face a unique and extreme form of vulnerability. They're not protecting high-value assets like art or corporate secrets. They're protecting piles of lumber, concrete mixers, and unfinished structures. The sites are often in remote or semi-remote locations, far from the nearest police station. The trailers they work in are flimsy, temporary structures, more like garden sheds than secure offices. And the people who target these sites know all of this. They know that the guard is alone. They know that the response time for police is long, 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes in rural areas. They know that a trailer in the middle of a dark fenced lot is as isolated as a cabin in the woods. And they know that if they use force, there's no one to stop them. No one to intervene, no one to save the guard. Patrick McDonald's murder is a case study in that vulnerability. He was hired to deter crime, but he was given no tools to defend himself. No weapon, no backup, no secure location. Just a phone, a lockbox, and the hope that his presence alone would be enough. It wasn't. The men who killed him made a calculation. They decided that stealing a few $100s was worth the risk. And when Patrick became an obstacle, when he was simply there, in the way, a witness to their crime, they decided that eliminating him was easier than walking away. Patrick McDonald went to work on a cold night in 1994. He clocked in, drove to the construction site, unlocked the trailer, and settled in for another quiet shift, watching over a supermarket that didn't even exist yet. He probably thought about his family. He probably thought about what he'd do when his shift ended. He probably listened to the radio, drank coffee from a thermos, watched the clock tick slowly toward dawn. He probably never imagined that he wouldn't make it. But two men climbed over a fence, walked across a muddy construction site, and approached a trailer glowing in the darkness. And when they left, Patrick McDonald was dead, and they were carrying a lockbox that contained less money than most people spend on a weekend. The construction site became a supermarket. The trailer was hauled away. The mud was paved over. But the memory of what happened there, the murder of a man who was just trying to do his job, who was just trying to make a living, remains. The men who killed Patrick McDonald are still out there. Unless they were arrested for other crimes and their involvement in this case was never discovered, they walked away free. They spent the money. They moved on with their lives. And Patrick's life ended in that trailer. In the dark. In the silence of a construction site that no one was watching. And the question remains, when you're alone in a trailer in the dark, surrounded by emptiness and silence, and you hear footsteps approaching in the night, what do you do? Patrick McDonald found out, and it cost him everything. The high-rise trap. The murder of Ida Mae Ford. Albuquerque, New Mexico, 1981. There's something uniquely unsettling about an empty office building at night. During the day, these buildings pulse with live phones ringing, keyboards clicking, voices echoing through conference rooms, the hum of hundreds or thousands of people going about their work. But when the sun sets and the workers leave, the buildings transform. The fluorescent lights stay on in some areas, casting harsh shadows down empty corridors. The elevators sit silent and waiting. The polished marble floors reflect nothing but emptiness. And somewhere in that vast vertical maze of offices and hallways, a single security guard makes their rounds, checking doors, ensuring everything is locked and secure, watching over a building that has become a ghost town. In 1981, Ida Mae Ford was working as a security guard at a downtown office building in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She was 62 years old, a grandmother, and by all accounts, a warm, friendly woman who had taken the security job to supplement her retirement income. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and the overnight shift paid a bit more than days. The building she guarded was a modern glass and steel high-rise, the kind of structure that represented progress, corporate success, and urban development. During the day, the building was filled with lawyers, accountants, insurance agents, and other white-collar professionals. But at night, it belonged to Ida Mae Ford. She was the sole guardian of multiple floors of empty offices, the only person in the building after the cleaning crews finished and left around midnight. Her job was simple: walk the floors, check that all the doors were locked, make sure no one had broken in, and report any problems. It was a job that required diligence and attention, but it was also profoundly lonely. The building was so quiet at night that you could hear your own footsteps echoing down the hallways, bouncing off the walls, creating the illusion that someone else was there with you. But on the night Ida Mae Ford was murdered, someone else was there. And it wasn't an illusion. The exact timeline of what happened that night has been pieced together through forensic evidence, witness statements, and the grim reality of the crime scene. Ida Mae clocked in for her shift in the early evening, just as the last of the office workers were leaving for the day. She likely exchanged pleasantries with a few stragglers, wished them a good night, and then settled into her routine. For the first few hours, everything was normal. She made her rounds, checking doors on each floor, taking the elevator up and down, methodically ensuring that the building was secure. The cleaning crew arrived around 9 p.m., a small team of 2 or 3 people who moved through the building with vacuum cleaners and trash bags, working quickly and efficiently. By midnight, they were done, and they left through the loading dock entrance, leaving Ida Mae alone. Completely alone. Sometime after midnight, an intruder entered the building. How he got in remains unclear. Office buildings in 1981 didn't have the sophisticated keycard systems and biometric scanners that are common today. The doors were locked with traditional keys, and there were usually 1 or 2 entrances that remained accessible for emergency purposes or late working employees who had keys. The intruder may have slipped in behind the cleaning crew, hiding in a bathroom or a storage closet. He may have had a key, perhaps stolen, perhaps copied from someone who worked in the building, or he may have forced a door or window on a lower floor, exploiting a vulnerability in the building's security. Regardless of how he entered, he was inside. And he was looking for something: money, valuables, anything he could steal from the offices. But he wasn't expecting to encounter a security guard. Ida Mae Ford, making her rounds on one of the upper floors, surprised the intruder. Exactly where the encounter happened is uncertain. Investigators believe it was somewhere between the 4th and 8th floors, in a corridor or office area, where the intruder was attempting to break into individual offices. The confrontation was brief. Ida Mae, doing her job, likely ordered the man to stop, to identify himself, to explain what he was doing there. She may have reached for her radio or her phone to call for backup. But the intruder didn't run. He didn't try to talk his way out. He attacked. What happened next was a nightmare of violence. The intruder overpowered Ida Mae, a 62-year-old woman, against a younger, stronger man. He assaulted her, both physically and sexually. The attack was brutal, prolonged, and terrifying. Ida Mae fought back. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms proved that she struggled, that she tried to protect herself. But she was outmatched. And then, when the intruder had finished with her, he made a decision that turned a violent assault into murder. He dragged or carried Ida Mae to a window, a balcony, or a ledge. The exact location has been described differently in various accounts, but the result was the same. He threw her from the building. Ida Mae Ford fell multiple stories. Her body hit the concrete below with devastating force. The fall killed her instantly, or if she had still been alive when she went over the edge, the impact ended her suffering immediately. The intruder, having eliminated the only witness to his crime, fled the building. He left Ida Mae's body lying on the ground outside, surrounded by the cold urban landscape of downtown Albuquerque, and he disappeared into the night. Ida Mae's body was discovered early the next morning. A passerby, walking near the building just after dawn, saw her lying on the pavement and immediately called the police. First responders arrived within minutes, but it was clear from the moment they saw her that there was nothing they could do. The fall had been fatal. But this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a suicide. The injuries on Ida Mae's body told a very different story. She had been beaten. She had been assaulted. And the positioning of her body, the trajectory of the fall, and the forensic evidence all pointed to the same horrifying conclusion: she had been thrown. The Albuquerque Police Department launched a homicide investigation immediately. Detectives processed the crime scene, both the area outside where Ida Mae's body was found, and the interior of the building where the attack had occurred. They found evidence of the assault on one of the upper floors: blood, signs of a struggle, personal items belonging to Ida Mae that had been scattered during the fight. They interviewed everyone associated with the building: the property management company, the tenants, the cleaning crew, other security personnel. They canvassed the surrounding area, looking for witnesses who might have seen someone leaving the building in the early morning hours, someone acting suspiciously, someone who didn't belong. But the leads were frustratingly scarce. This was 1981, long before the era of ubiquitous security cameras and digital records. The building had minimal surveillance, perhaps a camera at the main entrance, but nothing that captured the interior hallways where the attack occurred. There were no clear images of the intruder, no fingerprints that matched anyone in the system, no witnesses who had seen him enter or leave. The intruder had vanished, leaving behind only the evidence of his crime: a brutalized body and a family's devastated grief. Investigators worked tirelessly to identify the killer. They developed a profile based on the nature of the crime. A male likely in his 20s or 30s, physically strong, comfortable with violence, possibly with a history of sexual assault or burglary. They compared the case to other unsolved crimes in the Albuquerque area, looking for patterns, for similarities, for anything that might connect this murder to other incidents. But nothing definitive emerged. There were theories, suspects who were investigated and cleared, persons of interest who were questioned and released. But without physical evidence linking a specific individual to the crime, the case stalled. Over the years, as forensic technology advanced, investigators revisited the evidence. DNA analysis, which didn't exist in any meaningful way in 1981, became a powerful tool in solving cold cases. Evidence from Ida May's assault was retested, and a DNA profile of the attacker was developed. That profile was entered into databases, compared against known offenders, and checked against evidence from other crimes. But still, no match. The man who killed Ida May Ford either had no prior criminal record that would have required a DNA sample, or he had managed to avoid arrest for any crime that would have added him to the system. The case remains officially unsolved, though investigators continue to pursue leads as they emerge. Advances in genetic genealogy, the same technology that has helped solve decades-old cases like the Golden State Killer, offer new hope. But as of now, the killer's identity remains unknown. Ida May Ford's murder shocked the city of Albuquerque. She wasn't a young woman in a dangerous profession. She was a grandmother working a security job to make ends meet. She was doing exactly what she was hired to do, protecting the building, checking for intruders, and it cost her her life. The family she left behind was devastated. Ida May had children and grandchildren who loved her, who depended on her, who couldn't understand why someone would do this to a woman who had never hurt anyone. The randomness of the crime, the fact that she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, that she encountered an intruder who decided murder was easier than escape, made it even harder to process. You might wonder what goes through someone's mind when they make the decision to throw another human being from a building. It's an act of such callousness, such brutal finality, that it's difficult to comprehend. But in the mind of the killer, it was a solution. Ida May was a witness. She had seen his face. She could identify him. So he eliminated her in the most efficient way he could think of, by making her death look, at least initially, like it might have been an accident or a suicide. But the evidence told the truth. And the truth was that Ida May Ford was murdered. The high-rise building where Ida May worked continued to operate as it always had. Tenants came and went. The offices were leased and released. Life moved on. But for those who knew what had happened, the building was forever marked by tragedy. Security protocols were updated. Buildings across Albuquerque and across the country began to take workplace safety more seriously. Security guards were given panic buttons, better communication systems, and in some cases, partners so they wouldn't have to walk the floors alone. But these changes came too late for Ida May Ford. The irony of her death is almost unbearable. She was hired to protect the building, to keep intruders out, to ensure the safety of the property and the people who worked there. But when danger came, she had no one to protect her. She was alone, facing a violent criminal in an empty building, with no backup, no weapon, no way to defend herself. And when she tried to do her job, when she confronted the intruder and tried to stop him, she was killed for it. The sterile corporate environment of a downtown office building is supposed to be safe. Polished floors, keycard access, professional tenants, it all projects an image of security and order. But Ida May Ford's murder proved that those things are superficial. That danger can penetrate any building, any floor, any locked door, and that the person hired to stand watch is often the most vulnerable target. The modern glass and steel tower where Ida May worked became, on the night of her murder, a vertical cage. The stairwells and elevators that connected the floors became pathways of danger. The empty offices became hiding places. The windows and balconies became weapons. For anyone who has ever worked a night shift in an office building, who has ever walked down an empty corridor with only the sound of their own footsteps for company, who has ever felt that creeping unease that comes from being alone in a space designed for crowds, this case is a reminder that the fear isn't irrational. Sometimes, the building isn't empty. Sometimes, someone is there who doesn't belong. And sometimes, the person who discovers them is the one who pays the price. Ida Mae Ford was 62 years old. She was a grandmother. She was working a job to supplement her retirement income. And she was thrown from a building by a man whose name we still don't know, whose face was never captured, whose identity remains a mystery more than 40 years later. The case remains open. The DNA profile remains in the system, waiting for a match. And somewhere, the man who killed Ida Mae Ford is either dead or living with the knowledge of what he did on that night in 1981. The high-rise trap claimed a victim, and justice for Ida Mae Ford has yet to arrive. The janitor's last shift. The murder of Myrna Opsahl, Carmichael, California, April 21, 1975. There are people who clean up after the world goes to sleep. They mop the floors of banks after the customers leave. They empty the trash bins in office buildings after the executives go home. They scrub the bathrooms, vacuum the carpets, polish the glass. They are the invisible workforce, the people whose labor makes the daytime world function smoothly, but who are rarely seen or acknowledged. Myrna Opsahl was one of those people. In April 1975, Myrna was a 42-year-old mother of 4 living in Carmichael, California, a suburb of Sacramento. She was a devout member of the Evangelical Covenant Church, where she served as a secretary and volunteer. She was known in her community as a kind, generous woman, the kind of person who baked cookies for church potlucks, who helped organize fundraisers, who always had a smile and a kind word for everyone she met. But Myrna's family was facing financial strain. Her son had medical bills that were piling up, and the family needed extra income to cover the costs. So Myrna took on a second job, moonlighting as part of a small cleaning crew that worked at a local bank after hours. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid, and every dollar helped. On the morning of April 21, 1975, Myrna was at the Crocker National Bank in Carmichael, not as a customer, but as part of the cleaning crew. It was around 9 a.m., and the bank had just opened for business. Myrna and a colleague were preparing to deposit the church's weekly collections, envelopes filled with cash and checks that the congregation had donated the day before. It was a routine errand, something Myrna had done many times before. She had no idea that the Symbionese Liberation Army was about to storm the bank. The Symbionese Liberation Army, known as the SLA, was one of the most notorious radical leftist groups of the 1970s. Founded in Berkeley, California, in 1973, the SLA was a small but violent organization that espoused revolutionary Marxist ideology and engaged in acts of domestic terrorism. They kidnapped heiress Patty Hearst in 1974, brainwashed her into joining their cause, and involved her in a series of bank robberies and violent crimes. By April 1975, the SLA was desperate. Several of their members had been killed in a shootout with police in Los Angeles the previous year, and the surviving members were on the run, hunted by law enforcement across the country. They needed money to finance their operations, to fund their movement, to stay one step ahead of the authorities. So they decided to rob the Crocker National Bank in Carmichael. The plan was straightforward: storm the bank, take the money, and escape before police could respond. But the execution was chaotic, brutal, and ultimately deadly. At approximately 9:15 a.m., 4 members of the SLA burst through the doors of the bank. They were armed with shotguns and handmade pipe bombs. They wore disguises, wigs, sunglasses, heavy coats to obscure their identities. And among them was Patty Hearst, the kidnapped heiress turned reluctant revolutionary, carrying a weapon and participating in the crime. The SLA members immediately took control of the bank. They fired shots into the ceiling to terrify the customers and employees. They screamed orders, demanding that everyone get on the floor, that no one move, that no one try to be a hero. They moved with the kind of manic energy that comes from fear and adrenaline. These weren't professional criminals. They were ideologues playing at revolution, and they were in over their heads. Myrna Opsahl was standing near the teller counter, holding the envelopes of church donations, when the SLA stormed in. She was confused, terrified, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was a bank in a quiet suburb. This was a Monday morning errand. This was supposed to be safe. But it wasn't. One of the SLA members, later identified as Emily Harris, one of the core members of the group, was moving through the bank with a shotgun. Accounts of what happened next vary, but the consensus is that Harris fired the shotgun, either intentionally or accidentally, and the blast struck Myrna Opsahl in the abdomen at close range. The impact was catastrophic. Myrna collapsed immediately, the envelopes of church donations scattering across the floor. Blood pooled around her as she lay there, mortally wounded, while the chaos of the robbery continued around her. The CLA members grabbed what they could from the teller drawers, approximately $15,000 in cash, and fled the bank. They piled into a getaway vehicle and sped away, leaving behind terrified customers, traumatized employees, and Myrna Opsahl bleeding on the floor. Bank employees immediately called for help. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Myrna's injuries were too severe. She was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors worked desperately to save her. But the shotgun blast had caused massive internal damage. Despite their efforts, Myrna Opsahl died later that morning. She was 42 years old, a mother of 4, a church secretary who had been depositing donations, and she became the collateral damage of a radical political movement she had nothing to do with. The investigation into the Crocker National Bank robbery was immediate and massive. The FBI, which had been hunting the SLA for over a year, took the lead. They processed the crime scene, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed the evidence. Witnesses provided descriptions of the robbers, and investigators quickly identified the crime as the work of the SLA. But identifying the perpetrators and capturing them were two different things. The SLA was a tight-knit, paranoid organization. They operated in secret, moved frequently, and trusted no one outside their inner circle. And despite the nationwide manhunt, they continued to evade capture. Patty Hearst was eventually arrested in September 1975 and charged with multiple crimes, including her participation in the Carmichael Bank robbery. Her case became a media sensation. Was she a victim, brainwashed and coerced into participating in the SLA's crimes? Or was she a willing participant, radicalized and complicit? The jury at her trial found her guilty, and she was sentenced to 7 years in prison, though she served less than 2 before President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence. But the other members of the SLA, the ones who had pulled the trigger, who had fired the shotgun that killed Myrna Opsahl, remained free. Emily Harris, Bill Harris, Kathleen Solaya, and other core members went underground. They assumed new identities, blended into society, and lived normal lives while the FBI's manhunt slowly lost momentum. For over 2 decades, Myrna Opsahl's killers walked free. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the case was reopened. Advances in forensic technology and renewed interest in unsolved domestic terrorism cases led investigators to take another look at the Carmichael Bank robbery. They re-interviewed witnesses, reviewed old evidence, and most importantly, they tracked down surviving members of the SLA. In 1999, Kathleen Solaya, who had been living under the name Sarah Jane Olson in Minnesota, working as a doctor's wife and community volunteer, was arrested and charged with her role in NSL bombings. Her arrest led to a cascade of other arrests and revelations. Former SLA members, now middle-aged and living quiet lives, were suddenly dragged back into the spotlight. In 2002, Emily Harris, Bill Harris, and Michael Borton were arrested and charged with the murder of Myrna Opsahl. The case against them was built on witness testimony, forensic evidence, and the statements of former SLA members who agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. Emily Harris initially denied responsibility, but eventually she admitted to firing the shotgun that killed Myrna. She claimed it was an accident, that the gun had gone off unintentionally, that she hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But prosecutors argued that whether it was intentional or not, Harris had brought a loaded shotgun into a bank during a robbery, and she was responsible for the consequences. In 2003, Emily Harris pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Bill Harris and Michael Borton also pleaded guilty to lesser charges and received sentences ranging from 6 to 8 years. For the Opsahl family, the arrests and convictions brought a measure of justice, but they also brought pain. Myrna had been dead for nearly 30 years. Her children had grown up without their mother. Her husband had lived for decades without his wife. And the people responsible had lived free, ordinary lives while the Opsahl family grieved. You might wonder how someone can kill another person, accidentally or otherwise. and then go on living as if nothing happened? How do you wake up every morning, look at yourself in the mirror, and carry the knowledge that you took a life? For the members of the CSA, the answer seems to be that they rationalized it. They believed they were soldiers in a revolution, fighting against an oppressive system. They believed that the cause was just, that their actions were necessary, and that casualties, like Myrna Opshall, were unfortunate but inevitable consequences of war. But Myrna wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a cop or a politician or a symbol of the system. She was a church secretary and a mother, moonlighting as part of a cleaning crew to pay for her son's medical bills. She was the help, the invisible workforce that cleans up after the world goes to sleep. And she became collateral damage in a radical political war she had nothing to do with. The cruelty of her death lies in its randomness. Myrna didn't do anything wrong. She didn't provoke the CSA. She didn't stand in their way. She was simply there, in the bank, at the wrong time. And when Emily Harris fired that shotgun, whether by accident or intent, Myrna's life ended, and the lives of her family were shattered. The Opshall family has spoken publicly about the impact of Myrna's death. Her son, John Opshall, whose medical bills were the reason Myrna had taken the cleaning job in the first place, has described the guilt he felt, the sense that his mother died because she was trying to help him. That guilt is irrational, of course. John was a child, and he bore no responsibility for the actions of the CSA. But grief and guilt don't follow logic. Myrna's husband, Dr. Trygve Opshall, spent years advocating for justice, pushing law enforcement to reopen the case, refusing to let his wife's death be forgotten. When the arrests finally came in 2022, he was in Hades, and he didn't live to see the final convictions. He died in 2009, having spent over 3 decades fighting for answers. The Crocker National Bank where Myrna was killed is no longer there. The building has been repurposed, the bank itself absorbed into other financial institutions. But the memory of what happened there on April 21, 1975, remains. Myrna Opshall was one of the countless people who worked the jobs that no one else wants to do. She cleaned floors and emptied trash bins and made sure that when the daytime world arrived, everything was neat and orderly. She worked quietly, invisibly, without recognition or thanks. And when she was killed, the CSA didn't even acknowledge her death. In taped conversations recorded years later, former CSA members discussed the robbery with chilling indifference. One member described Myrna's death as no big deal, saying she was just a bourgeois pig and that her life didn't matter in the grand scheme of their revolution. But Myrna's life did matter. To her husband, to her children, to her church, to everyone who knew her and loved her. The murder of Myrna Opshall is a reminder that the most vulnerable people in any society are often the ones doing the work that everyone else takes for granted. The janitors, the cleaners, the night shift workers, the security guards, they are the people who keep the world running while the rest of us sleep or go about our lives. And when danger comes, they are often the first victims. They are the collateral damage. They are the people whose names don't make the headlines, whose deaths are footnotes in larger stories about political movements or criminal enterprises. But Myrna Opshall's name deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, not as collateral damage, but as a person, a mother, a wife, a volunteer, a worker, who was killed for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The CSA members who killed her eventually faced justice, though it came decades too late. Emily Harris served her sentence and was released. Bill Harris and Michael Borton served their time. Patty Hearst, whose involvement in the robbery remains a subject of debate, was pardoned by President Bill Clinton in 2001. But Myrna Opshall is still dead, and her family still carries the weight of her loss. The janitor's last shift ended in a bank in Carmichael, California, on a Monday morning in 1975. She was there to deposit church donations, to do a simple errand, to help her family, and she was killed by people who believed their revolution was more important than her life. They were wrong. And the memory of Myrna Opshall, quiet, kind, invisible, until the moment she was gone, stands as a testament to the value of every life, no matter how humble, no matter how overlooked. The Factory Ghost. The murder of night watchman William Bill Gwatz. Mount Greylock, Massachusetts. 1980s. There are jobs so remote, so isolated that the people who work them become ghosts, present but unseen, alive but alone. One of the loneliest jobs imaginable is that of a night watchman at a remote transmitter site, perched on top of a mountain, surrounded by miles of forest, with nothing but the wind, the machinery, and the darkness for company. William Bill Watts worked one of those jobs. In the 1980s, the exact year varies depending on the source, but most place it around 1985 or 1986, Bill was employed as a night watchman at a radio or television transmitter site on Mount Greylock in western Massachusetts. Mount Greylock is the highest peak in the state, rising over 3,400 feet, and it's home to several communications towers that beam signals across the region. The transmitter site was essential infrastructure, keeping the towers operational, ensuring the signals stayed strong, preventing vandalism or equipment theft. But it was also incredibly remote. The access road was long, winding, and treacherous in bad weather. The nearest town was miles away, the nearest neighbor even farther. During the day, maintenance crews might visit, technicians might come to check the equipment. But at night, Bill Watts was utterly alone. His job was simple: monitor the equipment, watch for any signs of malfunction or intrusion, and call for help if anything went wrong. He worked from a small guard shack at the base of the towers, a utilitarian structure with a desk, a heater, a phone, and a window that looked out over the dark expanse of forest below. It was a job that required solitude, self-sufficiency, and a comfort with isolation that most people don't possess. But Bill Watts was suited for it. He was a quiet man, reliable, steady. He showed up for his shifts, did his work, and asked for nothing more than his paycheck. Until the night someone came for him. The exact details of Bill Watts's murder are difficult to confirm. Records from the 1980s are sparse, and media coverage of the case was limited, likely due to the remote location and the lack of immediate leads. But the general outline of what happened has been reconstructed through investigative reports and accounts from those familiar with the case. Sometime during one of Bill's overnight shifts, likely between midnight and 4 a.m., when the world is at its darkest and most silent, an intruder approached the transmitter site. How this person made it up the mountain is unclear. The access road was gated, and Bill would have heard a vehicle approaching. So the intruder likely came on foot, hiking up the mountain under cover of darkness, moving quietly through the forest, avoiding detection. The motive appears to have been robbery. Remote transmitter sites, while not typically stocked with valuable goods, sometimes have cash on hand for minor expenses or tools and equipment that can be fenced. But more likely, the intruder was simply desperate. Someone looking for anything of value. Someone who had targeted the site because they knew it was isolated and guarded by a single unarmed man. Bill Watts was in the guard shack when the intruder arrived. There may have been a confrontation, Bill ordering the man to leave, the intruder demanding money or access to the equipment. Or the attack may have been sudden, without warning, a calculated act of violence by someone who had already decided that killing the watchman was easier than risking identification. Bill was murdered. The method, whether he was shot, stabbed, or beaten, varies depending on the account. But the result was the same. Bill Watts, alone on top of a mountain, was killed at his post. The intruder then ransacked the guard shack, taking whatever he could find. Cash, perhaps some tools, maybe nothing of real value at all. And then he fled, disappearing back into the forest, leaving Bill's body behind in the cold, dark shack. Bill's body was discovered the next morning, when the day shift arrived. The relief watchman, or a maintenance worker, pulling up to the site just after dawn, noticed something was wrong immediately. The guard shack door was open. The interior was in disarray, and Bill Watts was dead. The local police and the Massachusetts State Police were called immediately. Investigators made the long drive up the mountain, processing the crime scene as best they could. But the challenges were immense. The site was remote, exposed to the elements, and had been left unsecured for hours. Any physical evidence the killer might have left, footprints, fibers, fingerprints, could have been compromised or lost. There were no witnesses. No one lived close enough to have heard a gunshot or a struggle. The transmitter towers themselves made a low, constant hum, a sound that could easily mask other noises. And the isolation of the site meant that the killer had hours to escape before Bill's body was discovered. The investigation moved forward, but the leads were scarce. Detectives interviewed anyone who might have had a reason to visit the site: maintenance workers, technicians, former employees. They canvassed the surrounding towns, looking for anyone who had been acting suspiciously, anyone who had sudden cash they couldn't explain, anyone who matched the profile of someone who would commit such a crime. But nothing solid emerged. The killer had vanished into the wilderness, and the trail went cold. The murder of Bill Gwadz is a nightmare of isolation. He was a man paid to watch over a signal that beamed to thousands of homes across the region. People listening to the radio, watching television, completely unaware that the infrastructure enabling their entertainment was being guarded by a single man on top of a mountain. And when Bill screamed for help, when he faced danger, there was no one for miles to hear him. You might wonder why someone would take a job like that. Why would you voluntarily spend your nights alone on a mountaintop, surrounded by forest, with nothing but machinery and darkness for company? The answer, as with most of these jobs, is economic necessity. The pay is better for remote, isolated positions. The work is steady. And for some people, people who are comfortable with solitude, who don't mind the quiet, who prefer the company of their own thoughts, it's a good fit. But the vulnerability is extreme. Bill Gwadz had no backup, no coworker in the next room, no security system that would summon help if something went wrong. Just a phone, and the hope that if he needed to use it, he'd have Tim. He didn't. The isolation of the Mount Greylock transmitter site is what makes this case so haunting. It's not just that Bill was killed. It's that he was killed in a place so remote that his death went unnoticed for hours. That the killer was able to hike up a mountain, commit murder, and hike back down without anyone seeing or hearing a thing. The investigation in Bill Gwadz's murder remained active for years, but without strong leads, it eventually went cold. The case files were kept open, evidence was preserved, and investigators continued to pursue any new information that emerged. But as the years passed, the likelihood of solving the case diminished. The transmitter site on Mount Greylock continues to operate. The tower still beams signals across western Massachusetts. The equipment is still monitored and maintained. But the memory of what happened to Bill Gwadz lingers among those who work there, a reminder that even the most isolated jobs carry risks. For Bill's family, the lack of answers has been devastating. He was a father, a husband, a provider. He took a job that required him to work nights, to be away from home, to endure the loneliness of the graveyard shift. And he was killed for it, by someone whose identity remains unknown. The murder of a night watchman at a remote site is a crime that almost defies comprehension. The isolation, the planning required to hike up a mountain in the dark, the cold calculation of killing a man and then fleeing back into the wilderness, it's the stuff of nightmares. But for Bill Gwadz, it was real, and it cost him everything. The factory ghost, the night watchman who guards the empty, silent places while the rest of us sleep, is a figure we rarely think about. They are the people who keep the lights on, who ensure the machinery runs, who stand watch over the infrastructure that makes modern life possible. But they are also, in many cases, the most vulnerable workers in our society. They are alone, unarmed, and often far from help. And when danger comes, they have no one to call on but themselves. Bill Gwadz was one of those people. He took a job that required courage, self-reliance, and a willingness to endure isolation. He showed up for his shifts, did his work, and guarded a transmitter site on top of a mountain. And one night, someone came for him, and he died alone, in the dark, with the wind howling through the trees and the towers, humming their endless signal to a world that would never know what had happened until it was too late. The case remains unsolved. The killer remains unknown. And Bill Gwadz remains a ghost himself, a man who watched over a signal that connected thousands of people, but who died in isolation, unheard, unseen, and unforgotten only by those who loved him. The mountain keeps its secrets, and the towers keep broadcasting. But the memory of Bill Gwadz, the night watchman who paid the ultimate price for a job that no one else wanted to do, endures. The industrial horror. The murder of Jeremy Britt. Kansas City, Missouri. 2018. There's a specific kind of terror that comes from walking through an industrial site at night, with nothing but a flashlight to guide you. The beam of light cuts through the darkness, illuminating a narrow cone of visibility. A stack of pallets here, a piece of machinery there, the gleaming metal of a crane arm stretching up into the blackness above. But beyond that circle of light, everything is shadow, and your imagination fills in the gaps, turning ordinary shapes into potential threats, transforming the silence into something menacing. For security guards who patrol industrial sites, construction yards, and abandoned factories, this is the reality of the job. You walk through vast empty spaces with your flashlight, checking doors, looking for signs of intrusion, making sure everything is secure. Most nights, nothing happens. Most nights, the shadows are just shadows, and the sounds are just the wind or the settling of metal structures. But sometimes, the beam of your flashlight reveals something real, something dangerous. And in that moment, the classic horror movie trope, the flashlight in the dark, becomes terrifyingly real. Jeremy Britt was a security guard in Kansas City, Missouri. In his early 20s, he was working for a private security company that contracted him out to various industrial and commercial properties around the city. The work was steady but unremarkable. Long shifts spent walking the perimeter of warehouses, checking locks on storage facilities, deterring trespassers and thieves. On the night of January 19th, 2018, Jeremy was assigned to patrol a large industrial site on the outskirts of Kansas City. The site was a sprawling complex of warehouses, storage yards, and heavy equipment. Bulldozers, cranes, shipping containers stacked in rows like enormous steel building blocks. During the day, the site buzzed with activity, trucks loading and unloading, workers operating machinery, the constant motion of commerce and industry. But at night, it was deserted. Just Jeremy and his flashlight, walking the grounds, making his rounds. It was a cold January night, the kind where your breath fogs in the air and your hands go numb even inside gloves. Jeremy was bundled up against the cold, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth as he walked through the rows of equipment and storage containers. He was doing his job, following his routine, checking the areas where trespassers were most likely to enter. And then his flashlight beam caught something. Someone, a man, standing in the shadows between two shipping containers. Not running, not hiding, just standing there, watching. Jeremy called out. Standard procedure. Security, you're not supposed to be here. I need you to identify yourself and leave the property. But the man didn't respond. He didn't move. And in that moment, Jeremy Britt probably felt the first spike of adrenaline, the first flutter of fear in his chest. Something was wrong. This wasn't a confused trespasser or a homeless person looking for shelter. This was something else. Jeremy reached for his radio, preparing to call for backup, to report the intruder to the police. But before he could key the mic, the man moved, and he was holding a gun. The exact sequence of events that followed has been reconstructed through forensic evidence, security camera footage from nearby areas, and witness statements. What's clear is that the encounter escalated with terrifying speed. The man, later identified as Shindong Dave Hao, a 38-year-old Chinese national who had been living in the Kansas City area, fired at Jeremy Britt. Jeremy tried to run. He tried to take cover. But the industrial site, with its narrow passages between shipping containers and its lack of immediate hiding places, became a maze of death. Hao chased him, firing multiple shots. Jeremy was hit, once, then again. He collapsed between two containers, his flashlight falling from his hand, the beam still shining, casting stark shadows across the ground. Hao approached the fallen security guard, and then, in an act of chilling finality, he fired again at close range, ensuring that Jeremy Britt would not survive to identify him. Then Hao fled the scene, disappearing into the industrial complex, eventually making his way off the property and vanishing into the night. Jeremy Britt's body was discovered later that night when he failed to check in with his security company. Dispatchers, unable to reach him by radio or phone, sent another guard to the site to investigate. When the second guard arrived and began searching for Jeremy, he found him lying between the shipping containers, the flashlight still glowing nearby, illuminating the scene of the murder. The Kansas City Police Department responded immediately. The industrial site was secured as a crime scene. Detectives and forensic technicians began processing the evidence: shell casings, blood spatter, the trajectory of the bullets, security camera footage from surrounding businesses, and traffic cameras in the area. The investigation moved quickly. Witnesses who lived near the industrial site reported hearing gunshots around the time Jeremy would have been making his rounds. Security footage from nearby cameras captured images of a vehicle leaving the area shortly after the time of the murder. And forensic analysis of Jeremy's body and the crime scene provided critical information about the weapon used and the nature of the attack. Within days, investigators had identified a suspect, Shindong Dave Ao. He had been in the area that night, and his vehicle matched the description of the one seen fleeing the scene. But by the time police moved to arrest him, Hao had already fled. He had booked a flight to China, liquidated his assets, and disappeared. A warrant was issued for Hao's arrest, charging him with first-degree murder. But because China does not have an extradition treaty with the United States, Hao remained beyond the reach of American law enforcement. He was placed on international wanted lists, and the FBI worked with Interpol to track his movements, but for years, he remained a fugitive. For Jeremy Britt's family, the pain of his death was compounded by the frustration of knowing that his killer had escaped. Jeremy was young, just starting his life. He was working a security job to support himself, to build a future. He wasn't doing anything dangerous or reckless. He was simply doing his job, patrolling an industrial site, checking for intruders. And when he found one, he was killed for it. The nature of Jeremy's death is what makes this case a quintessential night watch horror story. The flashlight in the dark, the beam of light that's supposed to reveal and protect, instead revealed danger. Jeremy walked through that industrial site with his flashlight, sweeping it across the shadows. And when it illuminated Jindong Hao, it sealed his fate. You might wonder what Hao was doing at the industrial site that night. Was he attempting to steal equipment? Was he scouting the area for a future burglary? Or was he simply trespassing, looking for a place to hide or conduct some illicit activity? Investigators believe Hao was likely involved in criminal activity, possibly theft, possibly something else. And Jeremy Britt's presence as a security guard made him a witness that needed to be eliminated. Hao wasn't there by accident. He was armed. And when Jeremy confronted him, Hao made the decision to kill rather than flee. The industrial site where Jeremy Britt was murdered is the stuff of nightmares for anyone who has ever worked security. The rows of shipping containers create a labyrinth of narrow passages where visibility is limited and sound echoes strangely. The heavy equipment casts long, angular shadows that shift and move in the beam of a flashlight. And the sheer size of the site means that even if you scream for help, there's no one close enough to hear you. Jeremy was alone. He had no partner walking with him, no backup station nearby, just his flashlight, his radio, and the hope that if he encountered trouble, he'd have time to call for help. When you're facing a man with a gun, time is the one thing you don't have. The murder of Jeremy Britt is a reminder that security work, especially in isolated industrial areas, is inherently dangerous. Security guards are asked to confront trespassers, to deter criminals, to put themselves between property and those who would damage or steal it. But they're rarely given the tools to protect themselves. No weapon, no armor, no guarantee that backup will arrive in time. Jeremy Britt confronted an armed intruder with nothing but his flashlight and his radio, and he paid for it with his life. In 2023, nearly 5 years after Jeremy's murder, there was a breakthrough in the case. Shindong Dave Hao, who had been living in China as a fugitive, was arrested by Chinese authorities on unrelated charges. The details of his arrest were murky, but it appeared that Hao had run afoul of Chinese law and was detained. The Kansas City Police Department and the FBI immediately began working with Chinese authorities to bring Hao to justice for Jeremy Britt's murder. Extradition remained complicated. China's legal system doesn't easily cooperate with American requests. But the arrest gave Jeremy's family hope that after years of waiting, they might finally see justice. As of the most recent reports, Hao remains in custody in China, and negotiations are ongoing regarding his potential return to the United States to face trial. But the legal and diplomatic complexities mean that justice, if it comes, will be slow and uncertain. For Jeremy Britt's family, his parents, his siblings, his friends, the wait has been agonizing. They've had to live with the knowledge that Jeremy's killer fled the country and lived free for years while they grieved. They've had to watch anniversaries pass, holidays come and go, milestones that Jeremy should have been there for, all while his murderer remained unpunished. The industrial horror of Jeremy Britt's murder is in the details. the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing not an empty space, but a man with a gun. The narrow passages between shipping containers becoming a death trap. The cold January night, the isolation of the site, the realization that no one is close enough to help. It's the horror movie trope made real. The security guard with the flashlight, walking through the dark, checking the shadows, and finding something terrible waiting for him. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. And Jeremy Britt didn't get to walk away when the credits rolled. The industrial site where Jeremy worked continues to operate. The shipping containers are still stacked. The heavy equipment still sits in rows. The site still requires security, and guards still patrol it at night, walking with their flashlights, checking the shadows. But for those guards, the memory of what happened to Jeremy Britt is always there. The knowledge that the beam of light you trust to reveal and protect can also reveal something that wants you dead. Jeremy Britt was 20 years old. He was a young man working a job, trying to build a life. And he was murdered by an intruder who decided that killing a security guard was easier than being caught trespassing. The flashlight beam still cuts through the darkness at industrial sites across the country. Security guards still walk those rounds, still check those shadows, still hope that nothing dangerous is waiting for them. But Jeremy Britt's story is a reminder that sometimes the darkness hides real monsters. And sometimes the person holding the flashlight doesn't make it to dawn. The gated community execution. The murder of Robert Bob Vere. Pompano Beach, Florida, August 11th, 1987. The gated community is supposed to be the ultimate symbol of safety and exclusivity. High walls, controlled access, security guards checking IDs at the entrance. It's designed to keep the chaos of the outside world at bay, to create a bubble of privilege and protection where residents can live without fear. The wealthy pay premium prices for homes inside these communities, and part of what they're buying is the illusion of impermeability. But that illusion rests on the shoulders of the security guards who staff the gates. They're the first line of defense, the human barrier between the safe interior and the dangerous exterior. And in that role, they become the most vulnerable targets, visible, accessible, and often armed with nothing more than a clipboard and a radio. Robert Bob Vere understood this vulnerability. He was a security guard at the Palm Air Country Club in Pompano Beach, Florida, an upscale residential community with golf courses, tennis courts, and luxury condos. Palm Air was the kind of place where retirees lived comfortably, where wealthy snowbirds spent their winters, where the biggest concerns were usually tea times and landscaping disputes. Bob Vere worked the night shift at the main entrance gate. His job was straightforward: check IDs, verify that visitors were expected, log vehicle entries and exits, and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. It was a job that required alertness and courtesy, but it was also, in theory, relatively safe. After all, this was a gated community. What could go wrong? On the night of August 11th, 1987, Bob Vere found out. It was a warm Florida night, the kind where the humidity hangs heavy in the air, and even the slightest breeze feels like relief. Bob was stationed in the guard shack at the entrance to Palm Air, a small glass-enclosed booth that was lit from the inside, making it visible from the road. The booth was designed for visibility and accessibility. Residents and visitors needed to see the guard, to pull up and speak with him, to be waved through once their credentials were verified. But that same visibility made Bob a target. He sat in a glass fishbowl, illuminated like a display, visible to anyone driving past or approaching the gate. He couldn't see into the darkness beyond the reach of the gate lights, but anyone out there could see him clearly. Sometime after 11:00 p.m., a vehicle approached the gate. Bob, following protocol, stepped out of the guard shack or leaned out the window to speak with the occupants. But this wasn't a resident returning home. This wasn't a lost driver asking for directions. This was a robbery crew, and they were there for Bob's gun. Security guards at gated communities are often armed, not with high-powered weapons, but with handguns for personal protection and deterrence. The gun meant to be a symbol of authority, a tool of last resort if a situation escalates beyond control. But for criminals, that gun is an asset. It's a weapon they can steal and use for other crimes, and it's worth more than cash or a wallet. The robbers approached Bob Vere and demanded his weapon. Accounts of what happened next vary slightly, but the consensus is that Bob complied. He didn't resist. He didn't try to be a hero. He handed over the gun, following the training that says property isn't worth dying for. But the robbers didn't leave. They didn't take the gun and flee. Instead, in an act of cold-blooded brutality, they shot Bob Weir execution style. He collapsed in or near the guard shack, mortally wounded, while the robbers fled into the night. Residents inside the community, hearing the gunshot or noticing that the gate was unmanned, called 911. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes, but Bob Weir was already dead or dying. The guard shack, designed to be a place of safety and control, had become a death trap, a lit glass box that made Bob visible and vulnerable, with no cover and no escape. The Broward County Sheriff's Office launched an immediate homicide investigation. Detectives processed the crime scene, interviewed witnesses, and canvassed the surrounding area looking for anyone who had seen the vehicle or the suspects. They collected physical evidence, shell casings, fingerprints, tire tracks, and began building a timeline of the attack. The motive was clear: robbery. The robbers had targeted Bob Weir specifically for his gun. But the execution-style killing suggested something more. Either the robbers were eliminating a witness who could identify them, or they were cold-blooded enough that killing was simply part of their MO way. Investigators pursued leads aggressively. They looked at recent robberies in the area, searching for patterns or similar crimes. They interviewed known offenders who had histories of targeting security guards or stealing firearms. They reviewed security footage from nearby businesses and traffic cameras, hoping to identify the vehicle used in the attack. But the leads were frustratingly scarce. The robbers had approached the gate under cover of darkness, committed the murder, and fled before anyone could get a clear look at them or their vehicle. Witnesses inside the community had heard the gunshot, but by the time they reached the gate, the killers were gone. The case went cold. Despite the intensive investigation, despite the resources poured into solving the murder of a security guard at a high-profile gated community, the killers were never identified. Bob Weir's murderers walked free, and the case remains unsolved to this day. For the residents of Palm Air, Bob Weir's murder shattered the illusion of safety. They had paid for security, for walls and gates and guards, and yet a guard had been murdered at the entrance to their community. If Bob Weir, a man whose job was to protect them, could be killed so easily, what did that say about their own safety? The answer, uncomfortable as it is that gated communities are only as secure as the people who guard them. And those people are often underpaid, under-equipped, and placed in positions where they are maximally visible and minimally protected. Bob Weir sat in a guard shack that was essentially a glass box. He was lit from the inside, making him visible to anyone approaching. He had no bulletproof barriers, no reinforced walls, no panic room to retreat to if danger arrived. He was a sitting duck, and the design of the guard shack, meant to project accessibility and openness, made him an easy target. You might wonder why security companies design guard shacks this way. Why not make them more secure, with bulletproof glass, reinforced doors, and better sightlines? The answer is cost, aesthetics, and the assumption that nothing bad will happen. Gated communities want their entrances to look welcoming, not like military checkpoints. They want guards who are approachable, not barricaded behind fortress walls. But that choice, prioritizing aesthetics over security, cost Bob Weir his life. The irony of Bob Weir's murder is almost unbearable. He was hired to provide safety and security to the residents of Palm Air. He was the person they trusted to keep danger out, to verify identities, to be the human barrier between their comfortable lives and the chaos of the outside world. But when danger came for him, there was no one to protect him. The residents inside the community were safe behind their walls and locked doors. Bob was alone at the gate, in a lit glass box, with no backup and no one close enough to help. And the robbers knew this. They knew that security guards at gated communities are isolated, that they work alone, that they're armed but not trained for combat. They knew that approaching a guard shack at night with a gun would give them an overwhelming advantage. Bob Weir complied with their demands. He handed over his weapon. He did everything right according to the training and protocols designed to keep guards alive during robberies. But they killed him anyway. The execution-style nature of Bob's murder suggests that the killers were either eliminating a witness or were simply so callous that human life meant nothing to them. They had what they wanted, the gun. They could have fled immediately. But instead, They took the extra step of shooting Bob, ensuring he couldn't identify them, couldn't testify, couldn't pursue them. It's a level of cruelty that's difficult to comprehend. Bob Vere was a working man, doing a job, sitting in a guard shack on a warm Florida night. He wasn't a threat to the robbers. He wasn't resisting. He had already given them what they wanted. But they killed him anyway. And then they drove off into the night, leaving his body in the guard shack. The entrance to Palm Air unmanned, the illusion of safety shattered. Bob Vere's family was devastated. He was a husband, a father, a man who took a security job to provide for his family. He worked the night shift because it paid a bit more, because the hours fit his schedule, because it was steady work. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying to make a living. And he was murdered for a gun that was probably worth a few $100s on the black market. A gun that the robbers likely used in other crimes, furthering the cycle of violence that had already claimed Bob's life. The residents of Palm Air were shaken. Security measures were increased. Guard shacks were reinforced. Additional guards were hired. But the damage was done. The sense of invincibility that comes from living in a gated community, the belief that walls and gates and guards can keep all danger at bay, was gone. Bob Vere's murder proved that the person hired to provide safety is often the most vulnerable. That the guard shack, designed to control access and project authority, can become a trap. That being visible, being the face of security, makes you a target. The investigation into Bob Vere's murder remained active for years. Detectives continued to pursue leads, to re-interview witnesses, to compare the case to other unsolved robberies and homicides in South Florida. But without a breakthrough, without a witness coming forward, without the stolen gun turning up in a way that could be traced, the case remained cold. The robbers who killed Bob Vere are still out there, unless they've been arrested for other crimes or have since died. They walked away from the Palm Air guard shack on the night of August 11th, 1987, and they've never been held accountable. For over 3 decades, Bob Vere's family has lived without justice. They've held on to the hope that one day, someone will come forward, that the case will be solved, that the men who killed Bob will be identified and prosecuted. But as the years pass, that hope becomes harder to sustain. The gated community execution is a cruel irony. The residents pay for security, for protection, for the illusion that they are safe from the dangers of the outside world. But the person who provides that security, the guard at the gate, is often the least protected, the most exposed, the first to face danger when it arrives. Bob Vere sat in a glass fishbowl on a warm Florida night, lit from the inside, visible to anyone passing by. He checked IDs, waved residents through, did his job with professionalism and courtesy. And when robbers approached his guard shack, he complied with their demands, did everything he was trained to do to stay alive. But they killed him anyway. And the community he was hired to protect went on living, behind their walls and gates, while Bob's family grieved and his killers walked free. The guard shack still stands at the entrance to Palm Air, though it's been renovated and reinforced since Bob's murder. Security guards still sit there, checking IDs, waving residents through, doing the same job Bob did on that night in 1987. But for those guards, the memory of what happened to Bob Vere is always there. The knowledge that the glass walls that make you visible to residents also make you visible to predators. That the job of protecting others often means sacrificing your own safety. Bob Vere was 42 years old when he was murdered. He was a working man, a father, a provider, and he was killed execution style for a handgun that his murderers probably used to commit more crimes, perpetuating the cycle of violence that had already taken his life. The gated community promises safety. But for Bob Vere, the only thing the gate provided was a trap. A lit glass box where he was visible, vulnerable, and ultimately expendable. And the robbers who killed him walked away into the night, leaving behind a body, a shattered community, and a family that would never be whole again. We pay these people to protect our property. We ask them to stand watch while we sleep, to patrol the empty buildings and dark hallways, to be the sentinels between our comfortable lives and the chaos that lurks in the shadows. We call them security guards, night watchmen, janitors. We barely notice them, but they notice everything. They walk the floors we've abandoned. They check the doors we've locked. They sit in guard shacks and trailers and basements, waiting for something, anything, to break the monotony of the shift. And sometimes, what breaks the monotony is death. Which of these night watch stories disturbed you the most? Do you feel safe in the places you think are secure? Have you ever thought about the people who guard those places while you're gone? These are the questions that haunt us. These are the stories that remind us that safety is an illusion, built on the backs of people we barely see. The night watch continues. The guards clock in. The doors are locked. And somewhere, in a building you've never heard of, in a place you've never been, the next horror is waiting to unfold. This has been Plain Sight Docs. If you found these stories compelling, subscribe and explore the crimes that happen in the shadows, the tragedies that hide in plain sight. Because the truth is out there, in the basements, the guard shacks, the empty hallways, waiting for someone to shine a light on it. Stay vigilant. Stay aware. And the next time you walk through a dark building at night, remember, you're probably not alone. This is Plain Sight Docs. Until next time,